Hello and welcome to Pharmacy Business Podcast hosted by Sean Roberts. Pharmacy Business Podcast is created to help community pharmacies discover and learn ways to run a more profitable and efficient pharmacy.
Here's our host, Sean Roberts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. Today, we have a wonderful program, so stay tuned for our podcast starting now. Today, we have a special guest on our podcast. Marina Buksov is a functional medicine pharmacist, health coach, herbal educator, and lifelong learner of the healing arts. She is the creator of Build Your Holistic Herbal Practice course, mentoring other healthcare professionals in clinical herbal as well as business skills. So without further ado, welcome, Marina.
Hi, everybody. I am really excited to be on the Business of Pharmacy podcast. And this takes me back to the time when I first started my podcast, the Holistic Pharmacy podcast, and I would do a monologue style episode in the beginning before I had guests on the show. So it takes me back for sure. And today I would really love to talk to you about how and why herbalism should be in its rightful place alongside pharmacy, why it diverged from pharmacy in the first place, and why it's now more important than ever to reintegrate it back into the pharmacy fold. So without further ado, I want to introduce myself first and foremost. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Marina Buksov, and I am a pharmacist and a health coach, an integrative herbal medicine teacher and herbalist, educator, and also a functional medicine pharmacist. So I do a lot of different things in the holistic and integrative pharmacy and coaching space and education space. And I love the education sector first and foremost, because I think without education, we have nothing. We have no foundation. So education needs to come first. And that's exactly where I feel people can start with herbalism, just by additional training and education. And what I'm finding is that herbalism and pharmacy are so interconnected, and so much history is shared, and so many roots go back to both pharmacy and herbalism, that it just makes sense for them to be together and to not be separated. So in this episode, I'll share with you a little bit about my journey and how anybody in any pharmacy setting can consider adding in herbalism to their toolkit. So to tell you a little bit about my journey is I graduated pharmacy in 2013. And I was really inspired by actually an elective that I had in complementary and alternative medicine, as well as two classmates that were actually a year ahead of me. So two alumni that headed both the integrative medicine club at school, and then also one of which introduced me to health coaching right after I graduated. So these two became sort of my guiding lights and mentors, where they gave me permission to step outside, quote unquote, conventional pharmacy. And I don't use the term traditional pharmacy in the way that most people do. I actually use conventional. And traditional to me actually does refer to herbalism and the shared roots. So I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. So after I graduated, I took a retail position in a community pharmacy, and I got the opportunity to work with herbs because I was in an ethnic Slavic Russian neighborhood where we actually catered to people who immigrated and who were used to seeing herbs, including whole, crude, bulk herbs for sale that they would then mix, as well as herbal and other naturopathic and nutraceutical products. So I consider myself really lucky to have had that experience, and it shed some insight into where in America, there are stark differences from other countries in the way pharmacy is practiced and how much is behind the veil of the prescriptive authority, and versus how many products are regulated or rather not regulated in the natural and over-the-counter sector here in the US. So when I traveled abroad and also looking back at my own roots, because I come from Ukraine and I lived there for 9 years before we immigrated here, I see that other countries have official policies when it comes to herbs and pharmacy, and many countries actually have incorporated herbalism as one of the stepping stones between self-care and pharmaceutical medicine, which then, of course, has a second section of RX versus behind the counter or over the counter products. So there's a wide variety of how herbalism is regulated, from very strict regulations, like in the German pharmacopoeia, and versus in the US where it's not regulated at all. And then countries in between like Canada or Russia or China that have a place for herbalism. So I think this is really interesting to look a little bit at the history of pharmacy at this point, because when we look into ancient times, we see that early humans have always used plants as either food or medicine, of course, as building materials and shelter as well. But we really see that we have co-evolved with the other four kingdoms, right? We come from the animal kingdom, and there's these other kingdoms, bacteria, and we have fungi, and we have plants. And of course, we have a lot of viruses too that are non-living organisms. And our genome and our microbiome, and really a majority of our cells we're now finding, are not of human origin. They're all of these different organisms that I just mentioned from all the different kingdoms that just came together to form our human body. And there are studies showing that we have as much as 70% more bacterial cells. So the data is inconclusive, but we know for sure that it's at least equal to the human cells, if not more. And I see different figures about this, but this just goes to show you that the point of human life and of life in general is to evolve and to adapt to changing times. And this is a parallel to us as an industry now, is that we must be adapting to the times. And what we're seeing is that the US is very much behind other high income producing countries. And we're spending a lot of our GDP on healthcare, yet we're not cost effective, and we are spending a lot of resources too. So it's just not a sustainable system. And the career options, of course, even though they're coveted and valued and high paying, and I see offices open up all over the place practically every other day around different neighborhoods where I live. I'm in New York City. And it is turning out to be a lucrative field. However, we're seeing so many people suffering, and still their problems, their chronic disease conditions are not being solved by all of these polypharmacy approaches, which we were taught to not practice. And we are trying to do medication therapy management as pharmacists, and we're trying to decrease and deprescribe, and we're failing, right? So we do need other solutions. We need new guidelines. We need new understanding of how we can prevent all of these chronic diseases from cropping up in the first place. And if anything, if COVID had any silver lining, it's that it opened up people's eyes to the fact that there is not always a pill available, right? Whether it's a supply issue, manufacturer issue, or this is something never before seen and novel. And in times of crisis, we can't rely on the system because it's just not designed to hold all of this weight. We have overburdened our system of conventional and allopathic medicine, and it just does not have the proper tools to serve everybody who is in need of help. What we're seeing is that the birth rate is falling, and the newborns and the young people that are being born, they are having much more chronic and debilitative and autoimmune and other immune mediated and gut disorders. From a functional medicine lens, like, we're just seeing a rise in all of these conditions from the younger population, and that's scary. Not to mention, of course, the cardiometabolic and the pre-diabetes and diabetes rates in both gestational and young people. So it's painting out this picture that we are just not equipped in the allopathic and conventional model to pick up the slack, right? We can't just continue to up the prescribing cascade and then prescribe something else for a side effect and have a pill for every ill approach. And this is exactly where I believe we should look to the past and reintegrate the role of herbalism as preventive and self-care medicine, so that each person is empowered as an individual to take control of their own health. So I am not saying we should not use any conventional systems. I definitely want everybody to go and seek emergency care for acute conditions and situations and accidents and anything that requires surgery. But we can't just give everybody surgery or a drug or something invasive and intense for every little thing. This is where the system is not designed to handle the demand that we are currently seeing. And so we need other ways, even with antibiotics, right? A pill that everybody loves because it takes care, right? Let's face it, it's an easy fix. It takes care of the microorganism. But what we're not focusing on is, first of all, antimicrobial stewardship, right? We're seeing more and more resistance from these organisms, and we are at a lack, and we don't know what to do about that. We don't have that many tools other than antibiotics, and just designing new super antibiotics is kind of the only thing that we're doing right now. But we're not really focusing on the host, on the terrain, on the person who is coming and exhibiting these symptoms of pathogenic or overgrowth, right? So what I'm proposing is that we look to the best that traditional, which is the herbal way system, has to teach us, in conjunction with what we know as pharmacists and as doctors. So to go back to the history that I touched upon, we saw from the earliest written records and archaeological data and records that people, much like other animals, were engaging with plants in a field that you are probably all familiar with a term called zoopharmacognosy, right? Where animals go and interact with plants for their medicinal qualities. So they seek out the medicinal qualities of plants for specific healing purposes. And we, as the human animals, are the top of that food chain and have actually, after millennia of interacting with these things as crude plants and having midwives and wise women and every single culture that was, including the native indigenous culture here, which was unfortunately wiped out, which is maybe why we have this stance towards herbalism, because we don't have the roots, besides the roots that immigrants are bringing over from their own countries, to really hold us down to this sacred relationship, this symbiotic relationship with plants. And so when you wipe out the history, you don't have a foundation to stand on. And when we became more and more adept at extracting things, and we had the Industrial Revolution, and we had the oil industry revolution, and we had the Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie partner up to reform medicine. And we had the Flexner report showing how medicine is lacking, which at the time was very much integrative naturopathic. And a lot of good did come out of that. We did become really good specific specialists for very unique body parts, right? Like almost microscopic body parts that we would pick apart, and we would know how molecules and atoms are interacting and how things are working and how to intervene. But what we're seeing is when we broke things down to that extent, we kind of missed the bigger picture and the whole. And this is why I like to use the holism concept. And the word holism, if you imagine a W in front of it, it really comes from the root of whole, meaning we're looking at the whole body. And we know from the World Health Organization's definition of health that it's the body, the mind, and the spirit that we need to consider. And a lot of times we just separate the body and the mind, and we don't talk about spirit at all in our modern culture. And when it comes to medicine, we have pills that treat mental health, and we have pills that treat, quote unquote, physical health. And we have this mind-body separation, but in reality, it is all a continuum. The mind and the body affect each other. The better we can support the body, the better we also see that the mind can function. There's a huge connection between the gut-brain axis. There's lots of studies on that. And also, like I said, the spirit concept of what we're here to do and what's our purpose. For the people that aren't raised with a strong religious foothold, they're kind of missing. And so this leaves them kind of hanging in the wind and having no grounding and having no tether. And people just get lost. And this is a huge factor, too, of why we're seeing so many illnesses. So people are lacking purpose. They are lacking nutrition from the food guidelines that we currently have, because lobbying happens with the huge industry players for processed foods and the meat and the dairy industries. And this leaves us bereft of the vital nutrients. We also practice soil stripping practices with our modern agriculture. So we're depleting our soil from nutrients. And of course, there's lots of toxicity in the environment. And we need even more nutrients so that our liver can properly dispose and process of all these toxins that we're faced with on a daily basis. So this is the big picture. And this is the big picture that modern medicine can't really tackle. So we need to look at these big pictures and these systemic factors that are affecting everybody on a public health level. And we need to start bringing this down into our health systems, including pharmacy. And so the perfect role of pharmacy practice is to be between the people and the doctors, right? There was a reason we separated doctors and pharmacies, because doctors are the experts at diagnosis, and pharmacists are the experts in how to deliver the best medicine into our cells so that we can have the results and the outcomes. So we're looking at dosage forms. We're looking at the person's pharmacokinetics. We're looking at the pharmacology. We're looking at many different things. And one of those things can be how were herbs traditionally used in their whole form. And there is something to be said about the synergy that happens and also the wider therapeutic index of these plants. So for the most parts, if we take the time to study historically how plants were used as medicine before they were extracted and synthesized into the current drug form, which we now know as pharmacists and we're now experts in, we can also see this whole other side of it, which also leaks into nutrition. So how is pharmacy connected to nutrition? It's through herbalism. It's through studying plants. So when we see what is the nutrient value of food, any food, that includes plant food. And we know, according to the Lifestyle Medicine College, right, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, we know that mostly plants should be eaten. They should be the majority of what we eat as part of our diet. And I'm on the boat and the camp, by the way, that we can eat animal products and we should eat animal products for a full spectrum of nutrients. The caveat is that we must source quality products, and it is difficult with the practices now, as I mentioned, with spraying and pesticides and Roundup and GMO. So all of these are big issues, and we must start to tackle them as a society. And we must also lobby for legislation, for legislature change. and for what we want to see on our supermarket shelves. Because shopping in a general supermarket, a lot of the times we're just buying empty calories. And a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie, right? There's a whole weight loss epidemic too, and obesity crisis in the States. And we can't reduce everybody's calorie intake and see a difference. Weight Watchers and programs like it, not to call any programs out, they have a place, and that's a start. But we need to start considering the nutrient density rather than just the caloric intake. Because if you're consuming nutrient dense foods, it's a totally different outcome that fuels your cells for health versus consuming processed junk food that depletes us even more because it's taking more nutrients that we don't have in order to process the junk out of our cells and via the liver again. So we need to support our organs. We can't just depend on our organs to function properly without the proper fuel. These are the basics of life, and it's foundational that we, of course, treat people where they're at, of course, give them temporary fixes, of course, give a drug when it's needed. However, we need to decrease our dependency. We don't only have an opioid epidemic in this country, we have a pharmaceutical epidemic, over pharmaceuticalization, over medicalization. When we meet people's basic needs, which includes, once again, mental, physical, and spiritual, when we meet these things as a community, as a society, we will see a reduction in the crisis of mental health and autism spectrum and ADHD. We have started to question again after COVID the need for vaccines, the studies behind vaccines, the data that supports public health use of vaccines. But that is just one little factor that's affecting kids. And I am not going to say exactly that vaccines are the problem, but I do believe when there's already a problem that exists, vaccines can certainly exacerbate them because it's just another trigger that has some toxins and has some overactivation component of your immune system. It's just by design, it's inherent. So am I saying we should stop vaccinating? No. Am I saying we need more data behind new vaccines such as COVID? Yes. And am I saying we need to support the basics and the foundational health by things like encouraging rest, by things like taking a day off work when you're sick, by things like normalizing as a society that we need to prioritize self-care and fill our cups first versus over focusing on productivity and the patriarchal models of performing. And what we can see then is if we give our body the proper tools, such as nutrients that we mentioned before, which can come from plants, which can be either nutritional or medicinal, and we give it the proper rest and the sleep and supporting all the systems from the get-go, then our systems can deal with things like stress much more readily. And we can actually increase productivity and performance. And there's data backing this too. There's data backing that absolutely free things like meditations, reduce blood pressure and other blood markers of disease. So we are just not utilizing these things. Some of these things are free and accessible to all, but because of our current lack of education and lack of support for people to implement these tools, people have a hard time. And the biggest thing is implementation, right? If you don't use a tool, then it won't work for you. So when it comes to herbalism and pharmacy, I think it's the perfect combination for us to be able to inform people not just how to properly take drugs and not just how to avoid side effects or mitigate drug interactions, but also how do we use plants? How do we incorporate medicinal qualities of plants into our food? How do we use food as medicine? This is the premise of Ayurveda, for example. So we can actually enhance our life and improve our terrain and how we can deal with stress and how we can lose weight and perform better and optimize metabolism and our mitochondria and how our liver and kidneys function as well, our brain function. Every single function that we have as a human if we eat correctly, if we practice those foundational lifestyle interventions, and we integrate it seamlessly into our healthcare system. So we don't just have somebody prescribe and dispense a drug. We actually have people go through and talk to either a nutritionist or an herbalist, or have them in our network, or have them in our pharmacies. There's innovation happening at the pharmacy level too, where people are designing health coaching programs or herbal programs or carrying products. So the one myth I want to dispel about herbs, because I think everybody is thinking this, I want to quote David Winston, one of my teachers, is that they're not either pernicious or poisons. They're in between, right? Nothing is black and white. So yes, we must be aware of what herbs can do and the potential for harm in herbs. There are poisonous plants out there. There are narrow therapeutic plants out there, but they're also beautiful, nutrient dense, really wide and therapeutic index and very safe to use plants that we can incorporate, like I said, into food directly, into medicine. We can powder them up. We can put them in our smoothies or our soups. We can drink teas, make it part of our ritual, which grows into a habit, which changes our whole entire life. And as a pharmacist, we have direct access to patients many of the time. So either in retail or ambulatory or even inpatient settings, when we're evaluating people to send them home for care, we need to be talking about this. We need to have a conversation, not just about their drugs, but about how a person lives their life. Right. And as a pharmacist, we have that opportunity and that access. And yes, we can have other health players, such as health coaches, come in and do this for us and maybe even change the payment systems, right, about reimbursement and things like that, and have more studies, have more evidence-based data that this is working. This is having an impact. This is saving us healthcare costs, which of course, is saving everybody tax dollars too. So we need to have that evidence. And from what I've seen in my practice and with my students, you are changing one life at a time. And my hope is that we change much more than one life. We just have an impact across the nation and on the whole world globally, that we start to take care of our nature, of our land, of our plants, so that the plants can take care of us. They can help us detox both when we ingest them and work with them medicinally, or even just by looking at a plant or walking into the forest. There's a concept of forest bathing. You don't even have to ingest a plant for it to be healing to you. That is the beauty. And city planning, right, involves landscaping, involves you having beauty around you, and plants filter out things too. We're involved in an intricate gas exchange with the plants, among other things. All of the organic compounds that make us up also make plants up. And so we have this living symbiosis with them and a continuous exchange. So I can't think of why we're not integrating pharmacy with herbalism already. As pharmacists, we already have the skills to be health coaches. And also we have just a little bit of education left to also become very proficient herbalists very quickly. So it is my belief that herbalism can hold its rightful place alongside pharmacy, inside pharmacy practices in any setting. And we can also be that safekeeper to make sure they're used appropriately and do not have drug interactions, and still play our pharmacy role using these herbal and pharmacy hats interchangeably. So what is needed for this? Well, it needs first a desire, an understanding that education needs to be there, right? You need the education piece. You need to also get clear on the legislature, the laws, the scope of practice. And then we need to advocate for what we do want to see. And with herbalism, we could really empower our patients with additional tools that can be easy to access and sustainable, because these are regenerative materials. You don't need to manufacture them in the lab. Patients can go and interact with herbs, like I said, just by simply being in a park or a forest. So these things are super accessible. You can actually use weeds as medicine. That's a little well-known secret to herbalists. And every living creature has a purpose. We just need to be aware. We need to educate ourselves. We need to advocate and be the change that we wish to see. And this is exactly what I offer in my program, where I educate a lot of pharmacists about what are these missing pieces of herbalism, how do we implement them in different settings, whether you're building your own practice, whether you are a pharmacy owner, whether you
Hello and welcome to Pharmacy Business Podcast hosted by Sean Roberts. Pharmacy Business Podcast is created to help community pharmacies discover and learn ways to run a more profitable and efficient pharmacy.
Here's our host, Sean Roberts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. Today, we have a wonderful program, so stay tuned for our podcast starting now. Today, we have a special guest on our podcast. Marina Buksov is a functional medicine pharmacist, health coach, herbal educator, and lifelong learner of the healing arts. She is the creator of Build Your Holistic Herbal Practice course, mentoring other healthcare professionals in clinical herbal as well as business skills. So without further ado, welcome, Marina.
Hi, everybody. I am really excited to be on the Business of Pharmacy podcast. And this takes me back to the time when I first started my podcast, the Holistic Pharmacy podcast, and I would do a monologue style episode in the beginning before I had guests on the show. So it takes me back for sure. And today I would really love to talk to you about how and why herbalism should be in its rightful place alongside pharmacy, why it diverged from pharmacy in the first place, and why it's now more important than ever to reintegrate it back into the pharmacy fold. So without further ado, I want to introduce myself first and foremost. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Marina Buksov, and I am a pharmacist and a health coach, an integrative herbal medicine teacher and herbalist, educator, and also a functional medicine pharmacist. So I do a lot of different things in the holistic and integrative pharmacy and coaching space and education